So I guess I'm live now. Do I just start talking? Is this how this works? Okay. I'm Bob Hasegawa, State Senator for the 11th Legislative District, and just here to have a chat, fireside chat, I guess, with y'all. I hope you've had a nice dinner. Hope I don't make y'all throw up during this next hour, but just wanted to let you know what's going on with the legislature right now. We're in the middle of session. We just passed House of Origin cutoff, which means that any bill that started in the Senate that was sponsored by a senator had to have been passed off the Senate floor as of a couple of nights ago, and the same for the House. So all the House bills are coming over to the Senate. All the Senate bills have gone over to the House for the opposite houses now to consider. We still have not. There's this trick thing called NTIB, though, necessary to implement the budget. So those bills are still alive. And the truth is, nothing's ever really dead down here. You know, things evolved from the primordial slime of the sausage making and sprout legs, and all of a sudden the bill is alive again. And you wonder, how did that happen? So it's interesting how things work down here, but for the most part, bills that have not been, Senate bills that have not been passed out of the Senate are pretty much dead, and the same with the House bills. So we're just working on the budget right now. We are unveiling our capital budget. Well, we did that today in Ways and Means. We took testimony from the public, what they thought of the capital budget. The operating budget will be unveiled on Monday, and then we're hearing it next Wednesday. So that's kind of where we're at with the legislature right now. So a little bit about my role in the legislative session. So I am the Majority Caucus Chair. So as a member of that puts me into this group called Small Leadership within the Senate Democratic Caucus. And we do most of the shepherding of processes throughout how the Senate floor operates and how we relate with the House, which isn't always a good thing, but we do the best we can, and then to get along with the governor's office as well. So besides being the chair of the Senate Democratic Caucus, I have several committee assignments. So I am on the Ways and Means Committee, and I've been on the Ways and Means Committee for my entire Senate career, but I've been on the Fiscal Committee in the House as well for every year that I was in the House. So I've pretty much been on the Fiscal Committee my entire legislative career. I am also on Business, Financial Services, and Trade Committee, and I'm the vice chair of that committee. I am on the State Government and Elections Committee, and that gets a ton of bills running through it constantly. And I'm on the Rules Committee. So those are my 4 statutory committees. I'm on other, they call them legislative committees or joint legislative committees, that sort of thing. So I'm on this committee called the Legislative Committee on Economic Development and International Relations. That's chaired by the Lieutenant Governor. It doesn't have really any legislative authority, but what it can do is try and identify areas that the committee thinks are important for the legislature to focus on with regard to economic development and international relations. I chair this thing called, don't laugh when you hear this, it's called JARC, JARRC. It's the Joint Administrative Rules Review Committee. The name is deceiving because it's a fascinating committee if you really want to take deep dives, because the Joint Administrative Rules Review Committee means we look at the entire Washington Administrative Code. That's our jurisdiction. So the way the legislature works is we create laws, right? And those laws are written in statute, which we call the Revised Code of Washington, or the RCW. But when we pass the laws, we can't micromanage every last little minutia about the law. So we leave it to the agencies to fill in most of the blanks on how this law applies on the ground. So agencies draft rules and create rules, which are then embedded and become the Washington Administrative Code, or WAC, WAC. So the JARC committee, we get to look at the entire WAC, Washington Administrative Code. So when people have complaints about any of the rules that were developed by the agencies or the WAC, they can write a complaint to the JARC committee, and then we can take a look at it. But there's a trick involved with this, because not a trick, it's more like a restraint. You know how back in civics you learned about the separation of powers between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. So WACs are developed by the executive branch, right? Which is headed by the governor, and then all the agencies that the governor's office oversees. DSHS, Department of Health, Department of Environmental Services, I mean, all of those things, Department of Licensing. The governor's office is responsible for running the state and how they apply the law that we create in the RCW, how they apply that on the ground. So because there's a separation of powers, the legislature we as a JARC committee can't actually overturn a WAC, because that was created by an executive branch agency. What we can do is scrutinize it, though, and offer suggestions. We can refer it to other legislative committees for them to take closer looks at if there's a problem that we think needs to be addressed. Or that's pretty much it. We really don't have any power, but what we do have is the power of the bully pulpit. So we can tell an agency they didn't actually follow or implement the Revised Code of Washington as we had intended it to, go back to the drawing board. They don't have to, but we can then go back next time we're in legislative session, pass a law that requires them to do something. So it's better if we can all just sort of get along, hear the issues that people are bringing, and try and correct them. And it's a good process, and it's a little hamstrung, but at least there is a process. So I have to say that. I'm also a member of the JLARC, and JLARC is a Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee. We have within our state one of the most highly regarded audit and review processes in the United States, actually. People look to the state of Washington as an example for how to audit and review the agencies to make sure that they're following legislative intent. Actually, last year, I got a bill passed that required JLARC to embed diversity and equity lens into their audit and review processes. So every time they go into an agency or a program to see how it's working, they have to also see, is there potentially negative disparate impacts resulting as a result of the way the agency or the program is operating. And if there are, then the JLARC comes back within their audit recommendation back to the legislature so we can fix it legislatively. Let me see, what other committees are I just gave up my seat on the Elections Oversight and Accountability Committee. There was another senator that really wanted it, so I'm happy to give up that extra work. Thank you very much. So those are the committees that I'm involved with. I hope that gave you a little insight about how the legislature works. If you do have any questions, though, I don't know how you ask questions on this thing.
Yes, thank you, Senator. My name is Courtney, and I'm helping to moderate this evening. And thank you, Senator Hasegawa, for that quick intro. As a reminder, you can submit questions in the comment section of wherever you're streaming live, and we'll be doing our best to get all of your questions in before the end of the evening here. First here, we'll kick it off with some pre-submitted questions that we received via a survey that we sent out in an email.
So were you saying thanks for the quick intro facetiously? I mean,
no, Senator, that was a great intro. It was great. Perfect. We will start first here with a question that was pre-submitted in advance from Nora in Seattle. She asks, how are efforts around progressive taxes going this session?
Oh, God. I feel like I'm banging my head against a brick wall, when I first ran in the election of 2004, that was a campaign issue back then. I ran on comprehensive progressive tax reform because I understand that our tax system is really upside down and penalizes those who can least afford it. Those people are penalized the most, and the wealthiest pay the least amount of taxes. So that whole thing needs to be adjusted. I also ran on universal health care. I'm still fighting on that front. But with regard to the tax reform piece, boy, there is a group that's been meeting, and they've had statewide meetings. I don't know how many meetings, but they've been holding hearings all around the state for the last couple of years. It's called the Tax Structure Work Group. And they're supposed to, they go in understanding that our tax structure is messed up. And so they've been holding hearings all around the state to hear from the people what they think needs to happen. We're waiting for that report, which is supposed to come out not before the session ends, but during the interim sometime this summer. But that being said, there's been some hope because I don't know if you've heard of the Ruckelshaus House Center, but they are a very highly regarded dispute resolution, not really a dispute resolution group. They find ways to resolve very complex and confrontational problems, things like the tax structure. So they did a series of hearings. It wasn't revolved around tax structure so much. They called it the Roadmap to Washington's Future. But in that conversation, they had something like 75 hearings all around the state. And the one thing that did keep coming up is how people feel like the tax system is unfair and actually do lean towards progressive tax reform. And that is all around the state. And to me, that was really shocking to hear that result come out from basically a nonpartisan group with leading a nonpartisan committee doing hearings all around the state. And this was one of the conclusions they came to, which was really fascinating to me. So I think there's a reality that people are realizing that what we have really isn't working, because who is suffering the most right now? We see income inequality at its highest levels since back in the 1920s. They called them the Roaring Twenties, right? You had the Great Gatsby, the people with extreme wealth, and you had so many other people living in abject poverty. And that kind of disparity ultimately led to the Great Depression, because who could afford to buy anything? Yeah, the rich people were getting super wealthy, but regular working folk were starving to death, literally. So the Great Depression happened. An interesting thing, I had a presentation on a bill of mine. It must have been yesterday, this morning. I've been running since 6 o'clock this morning. I can't tell you how many meetings I've had, just back to back, 15 minutes behind 15 minutes behind 15 minutes, just like, at any rate. So I can't remember when I had presented this bill, but it's Senate Joint Memorial 8006. And a Senate Joint Memorial is, if it gets passed like a bill by both chambers, what it is a message to Congress. We actually send this bill to Congress saying, please take whatever action is on the Joint Memorial. So Senate Joint Memorial 8006 is asking Congress to create the National Infrastructure Bank. The congressional bill is called HR 3339. But that creates a national infrastructure bank. And that bank will have the lending capacity to create $5 trillion worth of lending capacity. So we struggle right now to finance our infrastructure, right? We sell bonds, which is like, selling bonds is okay if you need money on a short-term basis, but when it's your capital finance strategy, selling a bond is like taking out a mortgage, right? You get to use $1 billion today, but by the time you've paid it back in 25, 30 years, you've paid back $2 to $3 billion, right? So yeah, let's sell a bond if we need to fix something that desperately needs fixing right now. But when we sell bonds year after year, it's like taking out a mortgage on top of another mortgage. Pretty soon you can't borrow any more money because we've hit our debt capacity. And that's where we're at. We cannot borrow any more money or sell bonds until we've freed up some debt capacity. And then there's more to that formula, because it also depends on how much revenue we bring in. But the point is, we have a fixed amount of debt capacity at any given time, and we're always at the ceiling. So this creating the public bank at the national level will create this huge lending capacity so that we can reinvest back into the states, so that we can start putting people back to work and building our infrastructure and doing all this good stuff like building high-speed rail and public housing to address the housing shortage. There's so many needs in our state. I started rambling. I started talking about progressive tax reform. And, well, actually, a public bank does fit in nicely with progressive tax reform, because it's one thing to get the money in a progressive manner. But once you get that money, what are you going to do with it? Are we going to stockpile it back in a Wall Street bank and let the Wall Street bank make money off of our tax dollars? Or can we create our own public bank and keep that tax dollars in Washington State so we can reinvest it back into our local economy? That's one of those no-brainer things that we should have done a long time ago. But so I was getting to the Depression, and in the Depression, President Roosevelt created this thing called the New Deal, and it was a jobs program. It was a massive infrastructure program and public works program to put people back to work, to build projects. But that all costs a lot of money. So what did he use to finance all of that capacity for the New Deal? Well, they had the public bank. It was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And that's what Roosevelt used to finance the New Deal, but also to finance us through World War II, because how much money did that take to finance a victory in World War II? So we did it because they had the public bank on the national level. So HR 3339 in Congress now creates a national infrastructure bank that's modeled after the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And that's how we can get the lending capacity to build all of this infrastructure that obviously we need. We're so short on housing. That's the main reason for housing inflation costs. Well, that's one of the reasons that there's not enough units to fulfill the demand. The supply is much less than demand. So that's why the costs are going up so high, which squeezes out people at the bottom, which is why we have so many homeless people out there. So we need to reframe our argument from affordable housing, which was a sales pitch. It was more like snake oil, being sold snake oil. We used to talk about public housing because the public is the only entity that has the capacity to build sufficient units of housing to offset the gap with the demand. But that narrative has shifted from public housing to what we call affordable housing now. What is affordable? Who knows? But affordable housing, because it shifted the onus from the public building the housing to private developers building the housing. And private developers will never build enough housing to offset the shortage of demand because it's not in their interest. It keeps the values higher. Another problem with our housing supply, though, is how hedge funds and these big real estate corporations that we never even can conceive of. I heard that 1 in 7 homes on the market is purchased by one of these hedge fund people now, and they're buying up all the private supply of homes, and that just drives the cost of housing through the roof. So if we can pass my joint memorial, SJM 8006, which asks Congress to pass HR 3339, then we can have the capacity to build massive amounts of housing communities. And when you think about public housing, people have this image of the projects or the slums or something. It doesn't have to be that. We can build beautiful communities that are multi-generational, that are mixed usage, that are transit oriented development around so that we can get cars off the streets, and that have classrooms for kids so kids can go to school in their own little communities rather than who knows where. Clinics, storefronts, we can build these kinds of communities if we have the right vision. But right now, under the current paradigm, we just can't do it. So that's kind of a long way around my talk around progressive tax reform. There is so much intertwined with it all.
There is, and you actually heard a couple of other pre-submitted questions already in that answer. So we will move on to one more pre-submitted question that we received in advance of this event. And as a reminder to those watching live, you can submit questions at any time in the comments section. This was submitted by Kathy. She said, "Thank you, Senator Hasegawa, for your strong statement on the Senate floor against SB 5919 about how the root of racism is fear. It was very powerful. How can we help you convince other senators to reject this rollback bill, as well as House Bill 2037, which will likely be before the Senate soon?"
Frankly, Kathy, thanks for watching. I thought there was a total of maybe 5 people watching TVW. So one of them being my sister, probably. Thanks. It's such a hard conversation to have. The racism is so deeply embedded, and it just feeds off of fear. And actually, tomorrow it's February 18th. and we're doing a floor resolution in both the Senate and the House, because in the Japanese American community, February 19th, actually, we call it the Day of Remembrance, because that's the day that Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 that incarcerated all persons of Japanese descent, whether or not you were an American citizen. You were just stripped of your civil rights without due process and put into an American concentration camp. So that was a result of fear. There was a congressional investigation afterwards, and they came out and said it was a failure of political leadership, which resulted in this unconstitutional stripping of people's rights without due process. And that's what fear can do. So I'll be talking about that tomorrow on the Senate floor, actually. We're doing the Day of Remembrance ceremony at 12:30 in the Senate. I'm not sure what time the House is doing it. But it's a day of reflection about how fragile democracy is and how we have to be constantly vigilant to protect our Constitution, our democratic rights. So, fear. How do you defeat fear? Well, Martin Luther King said you defeat it with love, and good first step is to quit threatening each other. Start looking at each other like human beings. I've thought about this thing like, when's the last time you ever heard somebody talk about the golden rule? My mom and dad used to talk about the golden rule: do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Just don't even hear that anymore. We've just become so polarized, and I'm really fearful about. We've got to get a handle on it. I don't have the secret sauce. I'm sorry. All I can do is just keep talking to the 5 people that watch TVW, I guess, and hope that you 5 are talking to 5, and those 5 are talking to 5 more. And pretty soon, maybe we can change the world.
Great. Thank you, Senator. We have one more pre-submitted question here. This one came in from Jerome. Can you talk more about the Move Ahead Washington transportation proposal and how it would help us here in the 11th District?
Well, the full proposal hasn't been revealed yet. So there's a couple components to it. There's all the projects side, which is all great stuff we needed, and the 42nd Avenue Bridge will be funded in the proposal. But there again, it's about public financing. How do we finance our infrastructure? So we're lucky that we got quite a good stimulus amount from the federal government, and so that's going to help a bunch. We're having the largest transportation and capital budgets maybe in history, especially for supplemental budget year. This is not when we write the main budget, right? That was last year. So we're just doing supplemental budgets this year. But the Move Forward Washington package is going to be pretty amazing in the scope of the projects that it will encompass. We're going to wipe, the state of Washington is under a $2.5 billion obligation just to fix culverts, roads, the state highways that go over these little bridges that go over streams, and then you see the creek going under the river, and they're like these corrugated pipes that the water flows through. Well, that's a fish barrier, and so the state is under a Supreme Court order to fix all of these statewide. So that's like a $2.5 billion, $3 billion obligation. So we're going to take care of all of that, meet that lawsuit's obligation. The problem is that's kind of a haphazard way of fixing things, because there's non-state owned culverts maybe right upstream or right downstream. So yeah, the state's culvert is a barrier, but we also have to fix these other culverts too that are also barriers. Otherwise, what's the point, right? Fish isn't going to even make it to the state culvert, let alone get past it. So, at any rate, we're fixing that. We're putting a lot of money into. Actually, this is pretty cool. We're going to subsidize transit fares for everybody under 18. Um, like I said, this is all stuff that's in the package. It may not end up in the final package because everything is subject to amendment and nothing's done until sine die happens. Sine die is the last day of session. Ferries, going to make ferries free for people, for passengers under 18. I think it's 18, maybe it's 17, I can't remember, but some cool stuff like that. I'm trying to push things like, let's get rid of the Discover Pass. Why should we have to pay to visit our own state parks? Parks are, to me, a fundamental core, not development, a core program that government is just part of being in society. We should have parks. Why should we have to pay to go to a park? That's crazy. At any rate, so we're looking at some of those other things. So there's the downsides, though, is we still need to finance it. What we're trying to do is avoid having to sell bonds. But when you do that, then you end up nickel and diming everywhere else, looking under the seat covers for spare change to finance these things, right? So fees. I think fees are like some of the most regressive taxes we can have, because if you want to drive to work, you got to have a driver's license. So if we bump the cost of a driver's license by 2, 3, 4 times, how can the poorest of us even afford to get a license to get to work? Fees, that to me, that's the real hard part to swallow, is all the different fees that are embedded to help finance the program. So I'm hoping that we can figure a way out of that. But the Move Washington Forward package itself is actually pretty exciting. So a lot of innovative thinking going on there, and our new transportation chair, Senator Marco Lias, I think is doing a really good job of thinking out of the box on a lot of this stuff, because I told him one of my main criteria is, especially in the 11th district, we have a lot of people who have to drive to get to work. Many of us are displaced from being able to live in Seattle and having to move further and further away to points further south, just to be able to afford to have a roof over our head. But that means we have to drive the most. So things like HOV lane fees, gas taxes, Climate Commitment Act impact charges. That one is a little different, because what I did was I had a JLARC study put on that to measure whether or not that new carbon tax process is going to have a disparate impact against people like the 11th district who have to drive so much further. But the taxes, like the gas tax, I told Chair Lias, please avoid any more hits on the gas tax if at all possible, because we already have like the second highest gas tax in the United States. It's just under 50 cents a gallon. Yes, we have to find ways to finance our highways and transportation budget, but I think we've tapped that well out. We need to look for different ways, which is why I think the public bank is so critical, the solution is just right there in front of us, yet nobody wants to go that direction for whatever reason. I think the banks have a very powerful lobby, and they do all their work quietly behind the curtain, like the Wizard of Oz. He goes back there, and all of a sudden something comes out, and you say, "How did that happen?" Well, that's how that happens. Is that there are some very powerful entities around that can make things happen or keep things from happening. And public banking is one of those things that really can be a solution for us. But that's a very difficult nut to crack. Did I answer your question about move Washington forward?
I think you did. Thank you, Senator, for that.
Thanks.
Another pre-submitted question we had here was from Mary. Can you speak to the efforts to reform the Growth Management Act this session to ensure there is less sprawl and more chance for affordable housing?
Yeah, so growth management, I'm glad we're finally having some of these conversations. Growth management happened long time. What is maybe 30 years ago, something like 25, 30 years ago. And the intention was certainly great. But I think now we can see that it isn't working because times have changed a little bit. And so we have to change with the times. So there's some adjustments being made. For instance, there's a bill that allows adjusting the borders to be more sensitive to where development actually is happening, but not increasing the land area that changed. So you can redraw the GMA, growth management area, a little bit, but you can't have a net loss of land that's within the GMA, if all that makes sense. So we're trying to be smarter about it. We're trying to, there's one very unpopular move with developers and the business community is that they get really fired up if you call it a loophole, but it really kind of is, because the county you can file for a permit, and the county, through the permitting process, it could take forever. It gets challenged, and through the growth management hearing board or whatever. But you get to lock your application in at the time that you lock the application in. And so if it turns out that the growth management hearings board says, no, that violates the GMA, you've already been vested in that application, so that you can go ahead and build anyway. So you look at what happened in the out Maple Valley a ways, actually closer towards Black Diamond. Well, you've seen all the development over there at Four Corners out Maple Valley Highway, but go even further out, and there's a development there. I can't remember how many thousands of homes were built out there. But what was the plan? How are those people supposed to get to their jobs in town? Or what kind of water and sewer infrastructure is there to support that kind of development? Yeah, the developer can build it for the site itself, but what about the surrounding water systems that have to feed it, or the surrounding sewer systems that have to carry the wastewater away? I mean, all of these things on the roads, there's just not the capacity. So traffic is horrible, of course. The opportunities for economic development are pretty slim, because the transportation network to connect with the rest of the transportation infrastructure is so poor. So anyway, growth management needed some adjusting. We needed to lock down the vesting dates for the permits and adjust how the borders can move a little bit without increasing total area, losing total area from the defined GMA. Did that
Thank you, Senator.
make sense? I hope.
Perfect. We have another question that came in through the survey we sent out prior to the town hall. And as a reminder to anyone watching on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, you can submit your questions live in the comments section and we can answer them here on this call. This one came in from Sylvie. How can we reduce gun violence in Washington?
Reducing gun violence in Washington. You know, I kind of view the gun violence. There's several different pieces to it that how I look at it. There's the increasing stress on everybody because of the economy and the pressures of the pandemic and the growing income inequality and the lack of resources. That people are getting desperate, and desperation, inside of a home, you start getting family conflicts, um, you know, financial problems are like the root of most family problems. And it just, I guess, long story short, the solution isn't necessarily in the guns, it's in the people and the society at large. We just have a society that's leaning, it seems to be more and more polarized, and people are more and more wanting to reach for weapons, especially amongst people who have not, people who have mental health issues, behavioral health issues, lack of resources, even basic resources. Um, that is a really difficult question to answer. How do we reduce gun violence? You can try and say, take away people's guns, but man, that would start an armed revolution and then everybody ends up dead. So I think getting to the root causes of gun violence, which is mental health, behavioral health, lack of resources, so more equity. And to me, equity is a long-term project. It took my parents' generation and their parents' generations, probably two generations, to build a middle class, really. And that's what we've gotten to a situation. When I grew up, I'll use this for an example, the economy was such that one person, my dad, could go to work, make a living wage. My mother got to stay at home, raise the kids. Talk about family values. That's the kind of economy that we had. One person could work, make enough so that the family could survive. And I feel privileged that I was able to live in that. But we weren't atypical, I don't think. There was a much larger middle class, or it was people's thinking about middle class. Yeah, we didn't have a whole lot, but we didn't know that we didn't have a whole lot, and we were fine. We had enough food, we had a roof, everything was good. Now we've created a society where everybody under the roof has to have one, two, maybe three jobs just to try and make ends meet. What kind of society have we created there? Well, if you look at the labor movement, which really was the way that they built the middle class, it's been under constant attack since right after World War II, actually, when they had the Taft-Hartley Act, and then Landon Griffin and subsequent acts that each one of the Taft-Hartley just decimated the labor movement that was reaching full stride in its momentum. But with the demise of the labor movement came the demise of the middle class. And that's another thing about gun violence. What does a weapon in your hand do? It makes you feel powerful, right? It doesn't really, in reality, doesn't get you anything. Yeah, you might be able to kill somebody, but what does that do for you in the end, right? If you want real power is in people sticking together and winning victories, the economic victories, so that your family can survive. That's real power. But real power comes from solidarity. And if we're constantly divided against each other, black versus white versus brown, political right versus political left, your religion's not as good as my religion, whatever. It's all meant to divide us, because what happens when we're all divided? We're weak. We have no power. And that's what we have to do, is pull together, and understand what our common interests are, not what divides us. And once we start looking at our common interest about being able to provide a living wage for our family so that we can raise our family with the capacity to do whatever they want to become, go to school, get a craft, trade, whatever. Anyway, gun violence, it's a means of somebody making themselves feel powerful when the reality is they aren't. They're at the weakest point. If you have to use a gun to assert your power, I mean, to me, you're admitting that you've gone over the cliff as far as an ability to assert any kind of rational power.
Great. Thank you for that response, Senator. It looks like we've got time for one more question that was also pre-submitted in the survey we sent out prior to this event.
Is nobody sending anything over any of the...
We've got a couple comments, but most of them are just saying thanks for being live and for chatting with everyone. So, but I'll make sure that your contact information is displayed following this event as well. So if anyone has lingering questions, they'll be able to reach you via your email or phone number or website.
Okay.
So
thanks, Courtney.
Perfect. This question comes from Julie Van Arken, who is also in Seattle. She says, yesterday, over 100 legislative workers protested their working conditions in a sit-out. Will you and your colleagues commit to passing House Bill 1806 or Senate Bill 5773 to give these workers collective bargaining rights this session by any means necessary?
I can tell you I would definitely vote for it, either one, but I don't know if we can get there. There was an agreement between the Senate and the House that the House vehicle would be the one to pass. Okay, that is 1806. By some strange happenstance, 1806 died in the House. So now there's no vehicle. So some of us are trying to figure out, okay, where do we go from here? How do we fix this problem? Because the House really messed up by not living up to their commitment. So, I'm not sure how we resurrect them, because, as I said very early in this gathering, nothing is ever dead until sine die. So but some of the tactics may require such a bending of the rules to get to that point that you don't necessarily want to do that, because it would be like throwing a nuclear bomb into the middle of a budget negotiation or something. I don't know. I hope we can get something passed or something done. But, I did a little bit of thinking about this. So the National Labor Relations Act governs private sector for the most part. Public sector employees are not protected by the act. But not being protected by the act is different than being prohibited from organizing, right? So that's a fine distinction that you have to think about. So that's why farm workers, for instance, farm workers are not protected by the act, but they still have organized and won victories, right? So, but public employees are left to the states to regulate public employment within their borders. State of Washington has a public employment statutes and a thing called PERC, Public Employees Relations Commission, to enforce the statutes. And while it says legislative employees are not protected by those statutes, it doesn't mean that they're prohibited from organizing.
Sorry about that, everyone. It looks like we might have lost Senator Hasegawa's feed from the stream here. I'm going to do my best to get him back on for the last few minutes here. But if you have any questions that haven't been answered throughout this town hall, feel free to send him an email at the email address that is scrolling on the bottom of the screen right now. And we will also have an outro video here in a moment that will show his web address, his email address, his phone number, as well as all of his social media channels so that you can be sure to stay in touch with everything that's happening during the 2021 or 2022 legislative session.